So we're here again with Richard Garner, host of A Third Way podcast, and we're going to be discussing, based on his extensive media background, some of what's going on, here in Canada, but it seems like globally, as it relates to a media push towards sort of, I want to say, blaming this pandemic as it is right now on the unvaccinated, right? We're seeing a lot more aggressive headlines and stuff like that appearing, really demonizing the unvaccinated. Why don't you break this down and some of what you've been seeing and what's going on here?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, as anybody listening or watching knows, the media plays a big role, generally speaking, in influencing society, and with that great power comes great responsibility, as they say. And ironically, where we've heard that the most over the last 5 years, especially, was from the left and left-leaning liberal media institutions railing against incendiary rhetoric from Donald Trump and others like him, and condemning the fact that he recklessly and dangerously would call out certain groups, certain demographics, with language that they would say could be either misconstrued or acted upon by, let's say, the more extreme or the more unhinged to inflict harm on people. And these are all valid concerns and things that I think you would agree are important. This is what you do with Collective Evolution. It's what you do with the Pulse. You're going to always be very careful about how you write headlines and how you talk about things, to make sure that you're not essentially giving somebody the permission space to go after and target a certain group or a person, and even potentially with violence. Well, cut to 2021, Joe, where the script has flipped. We know why. We know the temperature is very hot and very high as it pertains to the issue of vaccines, vaccine hesitant, unvaxxed, anti-vax, whatever terms people choose to use. So now you're seeing headlines that I'll tell you right now, Joe, sent a chill through me. And you can see for yourself what the headline is here. Unvaccinated people are quote unquote variant factories. Now, again, you might argue, well, that's technically true. Again, we're not going to get into the overall scientific conversation about this right now, but you can be sure there is one to be had, which I'm sure Joe will be having with somebody over the weeks and months. What I'm talking about is when you're in an editorial meeting and a story meeting, you are aware of the potential inflammatory effect and impact that headlines can have. When you're okay with putting words out like variant factories, you're getting now into dehumanizing language. And why is that important? Well, we know the history of dehumanizing language as it relates to Holocaust, genocides, and other massive historical atrocities, and what demonizing and ultimately dehumanizing the other can lead to. And if that was just an isolated incident, I would say, okay, fair enough, things happen. Then you're seeing what would be the bastion of the liberal media in Canada. The most highly circulated newspaper in Canada is the Toronto Star, and they would consider themselves, human rights advocates, very supportive around social justice and being empathetic. Well, look at this headline. This headline is, basically a threat. I don't know how you want to categorize this any other way. We need to start telling people to get their shots or they will face consequences. Joe, if that was a social media post on my feed by some Yahoo that I knew, I'd be concerned. But I know that this was vetted by senior people at a major establishment news organization. Now, you could argue that probably in the article, it's not as incendiary. It's more about ultimately restricting people's movement and their ability to participate in society. Again, a conversation for another day that you have had and will continue to have. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is the irresponsibility, the lack of consideration of what the potential downstream impact of headlines like this will be if this is happening in July, Joe. Okay? Where do you think this will be, especially now that it's been punctuated at the highest level when the CDC director herself, and again, imagine the conversation, Joe, behind the scenes that would take place prior to coming out and going, okay, we're all good with this? Yeah, we're all good. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, she starts right out of the gate. This has now become the pandemic of the unvaccinated. Again, we can debate that all day with more context and more time. What I'm saying is you have to understand that you are pivoting people's direct ire, anger, and worse, potentially, on a certain group of people with dehumanizing language that if we're now sitting here in the fall and now it's shifted, Joe, to a higher level of intensity, but it's also now coupled with, and we're going back into lockdown because of these people, and Delta variant is rising because of these people, and they're endangering you, and whatever. Well, we've seen historically what happens when that happens. People will take it, not everybody, but a certain fringe portion of the population who, with the right combination of disproportionate level of fear and hysteria, again, magnified by this type of media coverage, and coupled with a feeling of righteous indignation and even potentially a feeling of justification to go out and start to enforce people to get vaccinated or whatever it is, to get off of, get out of my building or whatever. All I'm saying, Joe, is this is the type of reckless, irresponsible, dehumanizing language that can lead to inciting violence, which generally all of these institutions would be against in other circumstances.
Yeah, and you know what? It brings up an interesting thing because, I can sort of hear the idea coming forth. Well, if this was on the flip side and people were saying dangerous things, downplaying the seriousness of COVID, right? So if this was the opposite side, they'd say things like, well, you're not happy with sort of banning and censoring, people's ability to have free speech. So how would you respond with regards to these headlines that are being written? I'm assuming you're not saying, well, these mainstream media headlines should be cast out.
No.
What is it? How do we sort of solve that from a citizen level when we see these types of headlines? How do we get people to sort of potentially question what they're seeing?
Well, I would say if we were talking about hardcore tabloids, okay, then I wouldn't be as surprised because they deal in highly emotional, provocative, deliberately instigating, inciting headlines. That's the whole tabloid game. Mm-hmm. In this case, you're having institutions that would consider themselves to be above that, to be purveyors of responsibility and maturity and objectivity when it comes to headlines, knowing how provocative they can be. When you're talking about a certain group, subgroup, then the us and them is already magnified. If you're going to start to be able to provide the permission space and the justification that these people deserve to be attacked, Joe, that's what you're saying. Yeah. You're saying these people brought it on themselves, and as the headline that I read earlier, they have to expect to suffer the consequences. Well, again, what happens if somebody says, like you see with sometimes somebody goes in and shoots up a place, and then what do? They go back and check their social media feeds. They see who was influencing this person, and then they attack that particular media organization or that person for having blood on their hands because this unhinged person was unduly and disproportionately influenced emotionally by the media he was consuming. So how would this not be the same here, especially by organizations who themselves have come out against this type of inflammatory language when targeting subgroups, and in fact have even attacked people and or media organizations and or politicians who they said bear the responsibility for certain types of violent acts because of their rhetoric. All I'm saying is, if you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk.
Yeah, well said there. And it's interesting because I know you have some personal experience too, having seen some of what has gone on in Rwanda with, in essence, what was like a genocide. Can you discuss that a little bit as it relates to this very specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it would be one thing, and I would say everything we've discussed to this point would be valid regardless of that particular experience. But in my case, I spent a month in Rwanda in 2004, doing a documentary on the genocide, the 1994 genocide of Hutus against Tutsis, and like most acts of violence between groups, there's years, decades, sometimes centuries of foundational context that underpins a situation. But in the end, it's always that final spark that's lit that creates what we remember historically, the atrocities that we can go through any history book and see. And what they all have in common is they didn't start overnight. Again, they had enough weight behind them. They had enough foundational conflict behind them that consciously or subconsciously, certain people knew how to elevate and amplify that underlying emotion and light a spark. How did they do it, Joe? They did it the same way every time. Dehumanizing language. So Rwanda was no different. The Hutu-Tutsi thing went back 100 years. The Belgian colonialists really at the heart of that particular divide and conquer. But as the weeks and months that led up to April of 1994, the media's role in ultimately finally lighting that spark was undeniable. The highly dominated Hutu talk radio, and radio still, but in 1994 especially, was the dominant medium of communication. Of course, not everybody, very few people had TV, et cetera, and forget about the internet at that time. So the radio was it. And there were a lot of, talk radio shows by at this point, angry Hutus who now refuse to refer to Tutsis as Tutsis. They started to refer to them as Inyetse, which means cockroach. And then there were like political cartoons in the print media that had Tutsis as cockroaches. This went on for weeks and months. And then, of course, ultimately, as many people that we interviewed, including perpetrators of the atrocities, we went to the prison in Kigali, interviewed people who did kill people. And many of them talk about it as though they're talking about a different person. And I don't mean just because they wanted to avoid responsibility. You could see certain people almost trying to remember or understand what happened to them. Like they couldn't remember that person that snapped and walked across the street and butchered their neighbor with a machete who they had grown up with, barbecued, ate with. And what they often referred back to was the weeks and months leading up to it of simmering anger with dehumanizing language. And one of the people I interviewed, Beatha Uwazaninka, and I interviewed her recently again, almost 2004, almost 20 years later, after being there in 2004. And Beatha is an incredibly strong, powerful, blunt, smart and very articulate person as far as how she shares her story, where she saw her mother killed in front of her by her next door neighbor, who they had again grown up playing this guy's yard, and this guy had never shown signs of violence in his life. But as she says, the right combination of incitement, of anger, of fear, of incendiary, dehumanizing language just came to a boil and when, the president's plane was shot down. I think it was April 6th. And then it was days later where this all sort of blew up. But people that she had known all her life were unrecognizable in their violence and hysteria. And in the end, I remember she told us in 2004, she said, if you don't think this could happen where you live, think again. And she could almost see that, the sort of Western media was kind of not maybe deliberately condescending, but kind of thinking that, well, this is Africa,
Yeah.
This is Africa. But she was very clear with her warning. And in our conversation recently on A Third Way, she reiterated that if we're making a very dangerous and serious mistake if we don't believe that the same types of ingredients that ultimately led to violence, whether it be in Rwanda or in Asia or in Europe or elsewhere in the world over the decades and centuries, if we think we're immune to that somehow, we're going to have a rude awakening.
Yeah. And I think I recall you saying something like 800,000 people were killed as a result of all that.
800,000 people. Some people believe the estimates are low. I mean, you always have, disputes about exact numbers, but I mean, it was also in 100 days. It's the most brutal, efficient, for lack of a better way to say it. Like, it was like a mass hysteria, Joe, that took over people that, again, like I said, people can't even look back and kind of remember what happened. So how much did this contribute? Well, what were the factors, Joe? And you tell me if this sounds familiar. Amped up disproportionate fear relative to the risk, further amplified and inflamed by the media, and dehumanizing language that takes away somebody's humanity, further amplifies the gap in the us versus them, and ultimately removes the humanity of somebody in a way that, and I've had people tell me, Joe, like many people that I know and would consider friends, you know what? If people die, I don't care. They deserve it.
Yeah.
When you get to that place, you've crossed the Rubicon, you've jumped the shark, whatever term you want to use. You're now in a dangerous place that we've already seen what fear from an infinitesimal threat can do to people in terms of their rationality and their logic. What, Joe, do you expect to see happening when that volume is turned up with lockdowns are happening again? It's because of these people and they're putting your lives at risk. Well, I think everything's on the table there.
As always, I appreciate your time and coming on and offering your expertise. For anybody that wants to see that interview you did with Beatha, I'll have a link down in the description there for A Third Way podcast. And, looking forward to doing it again sometime soon.
Great stuff, Joe. Keep it up. Thanks.